In 1839, the Boer Republic of Natalia was established, which lasted until 1843 when it was annexed by the British. Following this, it was transformed into the Colony of Natal. This in turn saw many Boers yet again leave Natal for the northwest. Here, they established two new Boer republics, the Orange Free State and the South African Republic, also known as Transvaal. In the 1850s, Britain actually recognized the independence of both republics. In 1852, the Sand River Convention was signed with the Transvaal Republic, and in 1854, the Bloemfontein Convention with the Orange Free State. A couple years later, in 1867, however, diamonds were discovered in the border region between Transvaal, the Orange Free State, and Cape Colony near the confluence of the Vaal and Orange Rivers. During this period of time, the region was claimed by the Hikra. The Hikra being a mixed-race people who, similarly to the Voortrekkers, participated in the Great Trek. Anyway, the Hikra quickly placed themselves under the protection of the British Empire in 1873, and later were annexed by Cape Colony in 1880. The region was thereafter called Hikra Land West. This created tension between the British and Boer republics, but in the meantime, another conflict was in the making. The Zulus were still a problem for settlers in Natal and the two Boer republics, and so the British suggested establishing a confederation of sorts. The Boers rejected this, but in 1877, a political crisis in Transvaal gave the British an opportunity to annex the republic. The Boers were, not unsurprisingly, unhappy about this, but worried if they rose up in rebellion, the Zulus would attack. And so, for the time being, they chose to accept what was viewed as the lesser of two evils. Nonetheless, the Zulus, led by King Cetshwayo, the son of Mapande, remained a threat to British hegemony. Sir Henry Bartle Frere, the High Commissioner for Southern Africa, envisioned the implementation of something akin to the Confederation model in Canada over in Africa. Having more or less dealt with the Boers, Bartle Frere now turned his attention to the Zulu Kingdom. A surprise ultimatum, which among other things included a demand that the Zulu military disband, was rejected by Cetshwayo, and soon afterwards the British declared war in 1879. The start of the Anglo-Zulu War resulted in a series of bitter defeats for the British. For instance, during the Battle of Isandlwana, a greatly outnumbered British force of about 1,800 men was ultimately overwhelmed by a Zulu force of 20,000. That being said, this victory was still a costly one for the less technologically advanced Zulu, who lost somewhere between 1,000 to 3,000 warriors. This, nonetheless, was followed by another Zulu victory during the Battle of Intombe. As all this was going on, Cetshwayo tried repeatedly to make peace with the British, but his offers were refused, and following the Battle of Kalumba, a clear Zulu defeat, many in the African kingdom began to lose their belief in victory. The first British invasion was followed by a second, larger, more heavily reinforced one, and on July 4, 1879, the Battle of Ulundi occurred. It was here the British effectively broke the military power of the Zulu. Cetshwayo was thereafter deposed and had to escape, while the kingdom was split into smaller parts administered by local chiefs. Zululand, however, was integrated into the Natal colony. Bartle Frere, despite having succeeded in, instigating a war that ultimately dismantled the Zulu Kingdom, didn't have time to savor this, as he lost his position as High Commissioner for Southern Africa and was delegated to a smaller office in Cape Town. This happened because, some back in London were not exactly jumping with joy the Anglo-Zulu War happened without Britain's express permission. Anyway, with the Zulus gone, the Boers of Transvaal felt enough was enough, and they rebelled in November 1880. This marks the start of the First Boer War, and what sounds like a very unfair matchup with the British military in one corner versus a ragtag force of Boer farmers in the other, was actually more balanced than it sounds. The Boers were skilled marksmen and hunters due to their lifestyle, and were more than able to hold their own with the British, especially in mountainous terrain where it was difficult dealing with mounted marksmen who were both mobile and accurate. The British were defeated in a number of initial battles, which greatly embarrassed the British Army, including George Pomeroy Colley, Governor and Commander-in-Chief of Natal and High Commissioner of South Eastern Africa. and so Kali moved to occupy a hill near Laing's Neck called Majuba in February 1881. The Boers got wind of this, however, and prepared to storm the hill. That being said, the British outnumbered the Boers 405 to 400. The Boers were definitely better marksmen, though, and therefore targeted the British from afar rather than in a direct melee attack. Slowly, the British lines started to crumble, as the fire and move tactics employed by the Boers were years ahead of their time in many regards. The British force, under near constant attack from a mostly unseen enemy, would eventually break. Kali, however, tried to organize a fighting retreat, but was killed in action. Immediately after, a grave was built for him at the spot where he was killed. In all, 92 British soldiers were killed, 134 injured, and 59 captured. The Boers, in contrast, lost just one man, while 5 others were injured. Later described as one of the most humiliating defeats suffered by the British in their military history, the Battle of Majuba Hill resulted in the signing of a peace treaty and later the Pretoria Convention, which granted the Transvaal Republic self-governing status. Though not fully independent and having to accept the British monarch as head of state, this was still a win for the Boers. In the years following the First Boer War, gold deposits were discovered in the Transvaal Republic, leading to a gold rush that saw a large influx of, unwelcome visitors from Cape Colony. The growing number of Uitlanders worried the Republic's president, Paul Kruger, who believed the British might soon outpopulate Boers, resulting in a loss of their newly acquired self-governance. What's more, the scramble for Africa was in full swing, which meant European powers, including the British, were doing all they could to possess as much territory in Africa as possible. And while the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885 aimed to prevent conflict by drawing boundaries between the various European powers' African possessions, it also set the stage for new disputes. What's important for our story is that Germany occupied much of what nowadays is Namibia. And if you're interested in learning why the map looks so weird here, check out our video about the Caprivi Strip. Anyway, Britain and Germany were increasingly in competition with one another, and London was not happy to discover that Kaiser Friedrich Wilhelm II of Germany had actually contacted the Boers. He apparently wished to congratulate them for preemptively stopping the Jameson Raid, a failed attempt by Leander Starr Jameson, a colonial administrator then employed by Prime Minister Cecil Rhodes of the Cape Colony, to trigger an uprising by British expatriate workers in Transvaal. Its failure was not only an embarrassment to the British, but resulted in the strengthening of Boer control over Transvaal and its lucrative gold mines. The Republic also established a close alliance with the Orange Free State, and Kruger was definitely right to fear British meddling. In 1899, the British demanded that foreign workers in the Transvaal Republic be given the right to vote, which almost certainly would have resulted in the Boers losing political control. Kruger refused and rather issued an ultimatum of his own. He demanded the British remove all their troops which had been amassing along the border in 48 hours or Transvaal and the Orange Free State would declare war. This too was refused, and so, on October 11, 1899, the Second Boer War officially began. Initially, the Boers, using speed and surprise, were able to win a number of victories at Kimberley, Ladysmith, and Mafeking. In response to this, British reinforcements were brought to southern Africa and mounted largely unsuccessful attacks against the Boers. However, British military fortunes soon changed, and in early 1900, a 180,000-strong expeditionary force invaded the two Boer republics. Though the British swiftly occupied the republics, numerous Boers refused to accept defeat and engaged in guerrilla warfare. Not wanting a repeat of the First Boer War, the British adopted scorched earth policies, including the systematic destruction of crops, slaughtering of livestock, the burning down of homesteads and farms. And for those civilians displaced, mostly women and children, they were forced into what initially were labeled refugee camps. The term concentration camp was later used for the first time in history to describe the camps operated by the British in South Africa during this conflict, where tens of thousands died from disease and starvation. Boers were not the only victims here, as African and colored peoples allied to the Boers were also forced into the British concentration camps. As later described by Herbert Kitchener, who from November 1900 oversaw and expanded policies devised to crush the Boers, the British strategy was to flush out guerrillas in a series of systematic drives, organized like a sporting shoot, with success defined in a weekly bag of killed, captured, and wounded, and to sweep the country bare of everything that could give sustenance to the guerrillas, including women and children. It was the clearance of civilians, uprooting a whole nation, that would come to dominate the last phase of the war. In 1902, the Boers finally gave up, which resulted in the two Boer republics becoming part of Cape Colony. Over the following years, Boers were increasingly marginalized, and there were mostly unsuccessful attempts to anglicize them. The gold mines of the region were now in the hands of the British, while African and colored peoples were, more or less, completely left out of the picture, possessing basically no rights. In 1910, the Union of South Africa was created from what had previously been the Transvaal Republic, Orange Free State, Natal, and Cape Colony. South Africa was now on par with the dominions of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. But this is where the story of Cape Colony ends. Okay, I'm going to give Cape Colony an 8 on the Ghost Countries Index. There is no denying South Africa's early history continues to have an influence on the country, for better or worse, even today. This, of course, also includes the Boers or Afrikaans people, the largest group of white South Africans. What's more, the Zulu are the largest ethnic group and nation in South Africa today, with an estimated 13.56 million people living mainly in the province of KwaZulu-Natal. So while the British may be gone, their descendants and those people they interacted with still continue to play a role in South Africa's story today. And that's something we might explore in some future upcoming videos. But as always, feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Also, a huge thank you to all of our supporters on Patreon, and if you'd like to support the channel too, there's a link in the description down below.